Hey everyone, this is David Pike, the Motorcity Mechanic. In today's video, we're going to be starting a 5-part series on removing and replacing the oil pump assembly on a Chrysler 3.2 and 3.6 liter Pentastar engine. And the vehicles we're going to be dealing with are front-wheel drive vehicles. Now the procedure that we're going to be using is the by-the-book method. Now, as I mentioned, this 5-part video series is the method that Chrysler recommends when it comes to removing this oil pump. I want to show you both the vehicle on the lift and what you need to take off of that. Also, we're going to move over to this engine on the stand, rotate it upside down, and show you step by step every one of the procedures for removing the pump. Now, once we get done with this series of videos, we've got another group coming out, and that group's going to be the shortcut method. It's going to save us a lot of time and aggravation because as we're going through this by-the-book method, you're going to see that we're going to run into some difficulties. We're going to have some stuff break and some stuff that we need to fight with in order to take it off. But for now, part 1 of this series, we're going to deal with the vehicle on the rack and we're going to deal with taking the lower stamp steel pan off. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and move out to the shop and I want to show you a Dodge Grand Caravan that I've got up on the lift. I'm going to point out some items that we need to take off in order to get access to the stuff at the bottom of this 3.6 liter. Now what I want to show you is what it looks like on the vehicle because we're going to be working on the engine stand throughout this video, so there's things you'll see on the vehicle that you're not going to see on the stand. For example, here's our stamp steel pan and we've got a plastic shield that's covering up some of the fasteners. And here's that section of exhaust that we're going to be fighting with if you're going to be removing the upper aluminum pan, which we are. Now the main thing is I want to point out the structural support that goes from the radiator support all the way back to the cross member that has the rack and pinion. It's this item right here that's blocking some of the fasteners we need to remove to get that upper pan off. And I'm going to point those out as we go throughout this process. Now for now I want to show you step by step how to remove this, and it's nothing too difficult. Now right here where that aluminum pan meets the transmission, you'll see that there's 2 rubber plugs. And those 2 rubber plugs are directly above that structural support piece. And that's why we need to remove it. Otherwise we can get to all the 5 15mm bolts around the perimeter from the pan to the trans, but it's those 2 10mm hidden inside the rubber plugs that we can't get to. So that's the reason why we're taking it off. Now when you go to remove that structural member off, you don't have to worry about the engine or trans falling to the ground because there's a total of 4 different mounts. We've got a trans mount on the left side and we've got an engine mount on the right side, and that kind of keeps the engine and trans bolted to the frame. Now as far as rocking forward and backward, we've got a rear mount on that structural support that the rack and pinion's mounted to. But the one at the front is actually mounted on that structural member that we're going to be taking off, and I'll show you how to do that without causing any damage. Now at the rear of that structural support member where it goes to that cross member, we've got a total of 4 16mm bolts we've got to take off. Now at the front of that structural member, we've got an 18mm bolt. And if you look, you can tell that the head of it is damaged. Typically that's from them parking too close to the curb when they pull up, or they hit that concrete block at the beginning of a parking spot. So nonetheless, damage happens, and we end up usually having to tap an 18mm socket on there for it to work. Now one thing I want to warn you about on this bolt is, depending on where you live, if there's a lot of rust where you are, the top of this bolt is exposed. So there's a chance that rust could accumulate or water actually settle in there, and then it's actually difficult to remove the bolt. You might start backing it off and then it stops. So at that point you're going to have issues because the threaded portion is part of the upper radiator support. So there's where you're going to run into some problems. So go ahead and grab your 18mm socket and start beating it on with a hammer. And keep doing it until you know that it's fully flush and it's fully seated. Now after taking that 18mm bolt out, if you look further back, you'll see 2 more bolts. And directly above that is a 15mm bolt. That goes through the front engine mount that I talked about earlier. Now we're going to back it all the way off, but we're not going to pull it all the way out yet, because that's what's going to be holding that structural member in place till we're ready to actually support it with our hand, pull the bolt out, and then drop it. So to skid up underneath, pick up on that structural member, pull that 15mm bolt out, and now you can drop it out of the way. Now this is just as good a time as any to go ahead and start draining the oil out of the engine. Now the drain plug is a 13mm. Now the main thing you need to do is make sure you got a catch can up underneath, so when you go to take it loose, we don't have to worry about it spilling everywhere. So just back it off and make sure you don't lose it. Keep it to the side. Now once all of it has drained out, we'll go ahead and reinstall that drain plug. Also at that time, go ahead and tighten it down. And I'll remind you again at the end of the video, just in case you didn't. Now if you look underneath while you're under the vehicle, you'll see a section of exhaust right here. This is the section we've got to take off in order to get to the upper aluminum pan. Now at the front catalytic converter flange, we've got two 13mm bolts. At the rear flange going to the rear catalytic converter, there are two 13mm nuts. There's also a clamp on the section of the exhaust leading to the rear of the vehicle that we've got to back off. And we've also got a 13mm bolt that's going to be attaching everything to the pan for support. Now once we get this off, we'll have access to that pan. Now in this front section leading up to the front catalytic converter, what we're going to do is we're going to spray the back of the nuts with some PB Blaster. We're hoping that we're not going to have any problems with bolts breaking or the rust building up. And remember, there's those 13mm bolts, and that's the front catalytic converter. So just spray it down real good, and we're going to let it soak for a little bit before we come back and try to break them loose without breaking them off. Now on that rear exhaust manifold flange, we've got those two 13mm nuts. And we're going to soak it down with the PB Blaster just like we did on the front and let it soak for a bit. Now while we're letting that PB Blaster soak into those 13mm nuts and bolts, I want to go ahead and talk about something I brought up earlier, and that's the rear section of the exhaust that attaches to that exhaust crossover pipe. Now there's a flexible joint that slides down onto the top of it, and there's also a clamp with a 15mm nut. Now we need to go ahead and soak down that 15mm nut with some of that PB Blaster and let it soak as well. Now we don't have a lot of room to work. We've got a catalytic converter back there, we've got the CV axle, we also got the cross member that has the rack and pinion there as well. So we're kind of fighting with space. So once you get that 15mm nut loose, try wiggling that flexible joint. You might have to apply some heat. Take your time, don't get frustrated. Also taking those 13mm nuts and bolts off at the flanges may eventually help with actually wiggling it free. So just take some time, because it's going to be one of the more difficult things that you're going to have to do when actually working on this section of exhaust. So at this point, wish me luck, because I don't have a lot of confidence that these 13mm bolts are going to come off, because the studs already look like they're in bad shape. Another thing I already found out is a 13 fits kind of loose. These are normally 13, so what I did is I grabbed a half-inch. Half-inch fits a little bit better, but I've got a funny feeling that no matter what I do, something is going to want to break. Alright, so we already know one broken bolt. There we have it, two broken bolts. So at this point, I don't have a lot of confidence that the rest of these bolts aren't going to break. So far we ain't had much luck, but you know what? We've soaked it down. All we can do is cross our fingers, hope, and of course we don't know until we try. So far, so good. And last but not least, there you have it. Now once you get the bolts off, you need to take a moment and inspect the threads. Now the one on the right side looks a little crusty, a little rough. Now the one on the left side, you look about halfway down, some of the threads are missing, and that shiny area also means we've got damaged threads further up. That's going to mean that the threaded nuts on that flange are damaged. We need to clean those up with a tap, and we're going to need to replace both of the bolts. Now when it comes to dealing with the flange with the broken bolts, remember these nuts are welded in place. The easiest way to fix this is to get a cutting wheel and cut both the nuts off. I don't recommend drilling them out and using an extractor to get the bolts or trying to tap the nuts. They're damaged. Easiest way, cut them off, get you 2 new bolts and 2 nuts. Next thing we're going to do is take that 13mm bolt off that attaches the bracket from the exhaust manifold assembly to the oil pan. So now that we've removed the fasteners, or in this case broke some of them off, we're now ready to remove this section of exhaust. Now it's going to take a little bit of prying to get it off. Typically there would be studs right here, so that would be protruding through the flange, so you'd have to get it up and slide it out. Being that they're partially broke off, it'd be a little bit easier. Otherwise you'd have to loosen up one of the catalytic converter assemblies, mainly the front, to kind of get you some play. But typically you can just pry right here using a small pry bar, and that'll separate this section of exhaust. Once you've got that off, then you could just work it off where the studs typically would be and remove this section. So now that we've drained all the oil out of the engine, we can go ahead and work on separating the lower stamped steel oil pan from the upper aluminum oil pan. Now we've got a total of 15 10mm bolts all the way around the perimeter, and we've got 2 10mm nuts. So we'll remove all the bolts and we'll back the nuts off, but still keep them in place. So that way when we finally break the oil pan free from the upper aluminum section, it doesn't just fall. So that way the nuts will keep it in place till we're ready to take it off. So go ahead and start taking those 10mm bolts off. So when you finally make it around to either one of those 10mm nuts, just back it off, but yet keep it threaded on the stud. That should be more than enough. So now we'll just go ahead and repeat the process all the way around. So at this point we're ready to start separating that stamped steel pan from the upper aluminum section. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to be using 2 tools here. I've got a dead blow hammer and a putty knife. And we're actually going to be tapping on the putty knife in between the stamped steel pan and the aluminum section, and we're going to break the seal on that 3-bond adhesive. And we're going to work all the way around the perimeter until we finally get it freed up. Now when you're going through your toolbox and you're looking for which putty knife is going to work best, there's a couple things you need to take into consideration. The first one is, do you have a lot of room to work in? If you do, then the width isn't a big issue. But if you've got an AC compressor, possibly an engine mount, section of exhaust, something to that effect in the way, you might need to choose something a little more narrow. And the other thing is, we're hitting it with a hammer. So you want something with a solid metal core. If it's not solid and it's got a hollow plastic handle, there's a chance that when you're hitting it with the hammer, you might damage it. So pick your corner where you've got some room to work, get your putty knife ready, and start tapping on it with a hammer. Now you're going to have to work it all the way around the perimeter till it finally breaks loose. Now the one thing you don't want to do is to grab a flat tip screwdriver or a pry bar and start wedging it up under here and trying to bend it up, because that RTV holds on very well. What you're going to end up doing is you're going to end up bending the lip of the pan, and then you're going to have issues with trying to get it flat, and then you're probably going to have some kind of oil leak afterwards. So just take your time and work all the way around the perimeter using the putty knife and a hammer. So after going all the way around with that putty knife, we've now got the seal broke loose. Now we've still got two 10mm nuts that are actually holding the pan to the block. Remember, we kept it there so when we broke the seal loose, we didn't have to worry about the pan falling. So we're going to go ahead and take those all the way off. And then what you need to do is, when you take the pan off, try to lift straight up. Try to keep it as level as possible, because even though we drained the oil out earlier, while we're working on it, some oil from the crankcase more than likely has made its way to the bottom of the pan again, so you don't want to make a big mess. So be prepared. Support this with your hand, because it's going to be overhead if you're working on the vehicle with the engine in it, not on a stand like this is. So go ahead and back off on the two 10mm nuts. Try not to lose them. Grab the pan. You might have to wiggle a little bit more just to break the rest of the seal loose, and try to come up straight. So at this point, we fought with a lot of stuff and we've got that lower pan off. Now the next part of this series, part 2, we're going to deal more with getting the upper aluminum pan off. That's another obstacle we got to go through to get everything there. Once that's off, we're going to start dealing with the oil pump. So if you like this video, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up on YouTube. Don't forget you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you get any comments or suggestions about anything you saw in this part of the series, please make sure to email me at david@motorcitymechanic.com. If you like to shop on Amazon, please feel free to use the link that's in the description. Any purchases that you make will help support this channel. Once again, everybody, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for part 2.